Summit. Apologies for the late start. We had problems with our speech-to-text unit and probably a PMSE problem because we couldn't get the mic to work to it. It's great to see so many familiar faces in the room, but also many new faces, particularly as we extend our reach to try and deal with some of the challenges ahead in what's an increasingly vibrant and dynamic industry, but also wider. It grows every year, and we need to try and take account for that. Can you believe it's 20 years since we first launched digital TV? And that moment, it was a world first for us. It transformed viewers' experiences immeasurably. And today, television continues to transform. Viewers enjoy new ways of watching TV, new experiences. They benefit from unlimited choice and convenience. But all of this makes for a much more complex industry for us as an industry and at the DTG to deal with. Launching digital TV also meant that we needed an unprecedented level of collaboration and innovation from our industry. At the time, the DTG provided that forum in many ways, and we need to look at what we do in the years ahead. It's in the same spirit of collaboration that we now consider the next chapter of TV today. To do that, we're joined by world-class speakers who will share their insights and knowledge as we go throughout the day. We're going to look at the drivers of transformation and possibly a transition to IP. We'll consider the business, technology, consumer, regulatory impact of this transformative change that we're all going to go on this journey over the next 20 years. New experiences mean new means of content discovery, new ways of reaching audiences and younger audiences who are proving a particularly difficult demographic for us to deal with as an industry. We'll consider how the world of work is changing and the challenges that it creates later in the panel this afternoon. So, throughout the day, there'll be plenty of opportunities for you to join the debate. If you notice in your seat pockets, you've kind of got a 1980s mobile phone replica that you can use to vote as we go throughout the day. Our world's changing, we know that. You're driving that change. Industry is very much driving that change. Whether it's going to be driven so much by policy going forward, or whether it's going to be driven by the viewer, only time will tell. Our goal at the DTG is trying to make sure that we do everything we can to guide you through these changes and help your businesses. So we need to know what's important to you. So I thought we'd just test the mobile phone handsets in your seats and ask you a few questions just to kick the day off and get you used to using the handsets. So the first question, which DTG benefit do you enjoy the most in your company? The industry network, biz dev, the D-book, or industry collaboration? And just press one button. And the answers are? Okay, we'll come back to that later. Next question. Which driver do you think has the greatest influence on where we go forward? IP, UHD, AI, or over the top, from a technology driver perspective? Of course, the viewer doesn't come into it at all, according to this. Oh. Very interesting. And I think we've got one more question. What support does your company need and most value from the DTG? So the first one's policy, if you can't see it. Second one is developing standards or help nurture standards. Third one is collaborative problem solving, trying to get networks working, etc. And the final one are our kind of technical facilities that we offer to the industry. And the answers are? Good, a mix. Okay, well, we'll see how that develops throughout the day. Also, we're quite keen to get engagement for you throughout the day. So there'll be plenty of opportunities for you to ask questions. And this is the most frightening moment of the day to me, Emily. I'm not going to catch this. We've got a throw mic, and the idea is If David wants to ask a question, you throw it to David. When he's finished, you speak into the top of it, say hello.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Hello, everyone.
That's not scary. And then you throw it back either to Emily or to the next person that asks the question. A few more things just to aid your enjoyment of the event. You need a brochure to see a full program, plus some biographies of our speakers. So we're not going to read those out on stage. You've got the Wi-Fi code on the back of your lanyard, so I won't read that out. And do tweet, or if you're under 30 or pretending to be under 30, snap and gram along as we go throughout the day. We've got a photographer taking pictures that we may use or sell later. And we're also recording the event, and for the first time live streaming it, so our international members can see what we're saying as we go throughout the day. So just be aware of that. And finally, a very little bit of housekeeping. There are fire exits here and at the back. I could be an airline stewardess. Please turn your phones to silent, but please also do tweet as we go throughout the day. That's enough from me. I'd now like to welcome our first speaker to the stage, Matthew Postgate, Chief Technology and Product Officer at the BBC. And we put a tricky question to Matthew. We asked him to consider the road to an IP future. So, Matthew.
Letting me have the chance to speak today. It's an interesting question. The BBC is an organisation of storytellers, and the one thing that you learn at the BBC is that if you don't write your story, then someone else will write it for you. When it comes to how the internet is changing society, I think there are some truly amazing storytellers out on the west coast of America. The story that we've all become familiar with is one about disruptive new companies redefining industries as they sweep away the institutions of old. As with the best stories, large parts of it are true, but it's also a story that turns out to have a darker second chapter. In their effort to move fast and break things, some of the negative consequences were missed. The internet was supposed to offer infinite choice, but we've ended up with filter bubbles. Where the internet was supposed to usher in a new industrial age, we have seen the economic benefits increasingly concentrated within a few companies. I think that it's important for the people and organisations represented by the DTG to tell their own story about how the internet will change what we do. And it does need to be our story, just as the story of what has been achieved over the last 20 years has been our story. Today, I want to tell you, or at least start to tell you, the BBC's part of this new story so that we can write the next chapter together. A year ago, our Deputy Director General, Anne Bulford, spoke here and touched on the specific challenge the BBC has as we move towards an IP world. We know that some of our audiences are already using the BBC more on the internet than they do on broadcast technologies. Equally, there are some audiences for whom the opposite is still true. Everyone pays for the BBC, so we need to serve everyone in the UK in the way that they choose. More than that, we exist to create social value rather than shareholder value, and so reaching everyone is essential to delivering our mission. That's why we've always said that this current 11-year charter period will be one of transition. Many people have already adopted the internet as their primary medium, while many will continue to watch and listen to traditional channels. During this charter, we will deliver for both groups. Having said that, we believe that the days when all media will be distributed over the internet are not too far away. There are many reasons to be optimistic about this next phase of our industry. We've already seen a huge increase in the content investment, and the technology of the internet are going to allow audiences to enjoy greater breadth and greater control over their experience. The impact of on-demand is already apparent, but that is only the beginning. TV is going to evolve into something more immersive, more pervasive, more interactive and more personalised. We are already seeing the beginning of the shift. One of the simplest innovations is instant restart on live programmes. When we implemented that on mobile, a third of the people used the feature. And the internet is going to allow us to extend these ideas of breadth and control even further. You can't talk about the potential of internet broadcasting without asking the question, when? IP networks already do a good job of serving the on-demand version of the future. However, both fixed and wireless networks would struggle with the live output our broadcast networks deliver every day, let alone on a weekend like the one we have coming up with a royal wedding and an FA Cup final. A world of data caps and buffering for linear services is not going to work, although the problem will disappear over time. The balance between live and on-demand will shift further. Our networks, and importantly the applications that run on them, will improve. And crucially, we'll find editorial ways around the bottlenecks, which is something people often forget. But there's another critical point about the transition to the internet. For the internet to be an effective distribution network, it needs to be not only robust, but also universally available. Everybody in the country needs access without exception. And there's a third vitally important point to make. What if, even though you do have great fixed and wireless broadband availability, you can't afford to watch a royal wedding or an FA Cup final? In this country, we're used to the idea that our public service broadcasters can make sure the whole country can come together for the biggest national moments. But the IP future comes with no guarantees. At this nascent stage, the type of future we're heading towards is very much up for grabs. And this is not just true for audiences, but it's also true for our industry. For now, the UK remains one of the most vibrant and successful media sectors in the world, and arguably the most innovative and creative radio and TV market on the planet. This has been achieved in large part by the people represented in this room. It's driven by a sustained investment in British platforms and content, backed by a mix of funding models, advertising, subscription and public money, a strong public service broadcasting sector and a competitive commercial industry. It's a unique media ecology that's one of the jewels of the UK's economic crown. But the competitive dynamics of the internet won't necessarily sustain that success or uphold that ecology. We know that the internet economy during the last 10 years of growth has been directed by We know that the internet economy during the last 10 years of growth has been directed at winner-takes-all markets, controlled by vertically and horizontally integrated platforms of massive global scale. But these companies have no particular interest in sustained investment in a broad range of UK content, or in news plurality, or indeed of positive social outcomes. They're not necessarily interested in providing a safe place for children online or tackling fake news, both areas in which the BBC is working hard with others to improve. On the contrary, the incentives of today's biggest internet media organisations are to own and distribute globalised content, to capture brand attribution, and to control data and the routes to audiences. A move to IP distribution could follow a path where powerful, vertically integrated gatekeepers intermediate broadcasters' relationships with audiences, where the costs of both broadcasters and audiences spiral, and where British content diminishes and UK production stagnates. Despite the clear opportunity for audiences, why would a broadcaster risk moving quickly towards an internet future under such circumstances? When you take all of these issues into account, I think the really interesting question is not when, but how will we make the transition to being an internet broadcaster? As we think about the transition to IP distribution, it's important to remind ourselves that public service broadcasting has evolved not simply as a set of technologies, but as an endeavour, an act of will. It is defined not just by the technological opportunity, but also by abstract values and social contribution. It means that it has qualities and attributes that have been created and nurtured over decades: quality, breadth, universality, and even intimacy in terms of direct, unmediated relationships between broadcasters and audiences. We need these attributes of broadcasting to be carried over into the digital age, and should have the ambition for them to be amplified by the creative potential of the internet. My belief that the internet could make the BBC even more effective at delivering for audiences is what caused me to join the organisation in 2003. So for the BBC, the question about our IP future becomes not just when, but also how. Not only about how quickly can we get there, but how best and under what conditions. Which brings me to the BBC's policy on distribution. Early this year, we published our draft distribution policy for consultation, and we've now received responses. It sets out the conditions which we judge to be both reasonable and necessary for the BBC in order to meet our public service mission. Our starting point is simple. The more effectively we distribute our services, the more valuable they are to the public. The more convenient they are to find and the more easily identifiable they are as BBC services, the greater value for licence fee payers. That's why we've attached so much importance to curation and proper attribution when shown on other people's platforms. Similarly, knowing what people watch and how they watch it ultimately helps us improve the viewing experience. That's why we've placed so much importance on access to data. And of course, the less our services cost to distribute, the more the BBC can spend on British content. Delivering against these public service goals will be jeopardised if we cannot curate the breadth of the BBC's offer for audiences in order to inform, educate and entertain. Overall, the risk is that audiences benefit less from BBC innovations, consume a narrower range of BBC content and get less value from the licence fee. The BBC board is now considering all the consultation responses and will publish the final policy once complete. It's crucial that we get this right. It's how we will recreate and amplify the act of public service broadcasting on the internet. I want to finish by talking about how important it is that the industry in the UK comes together to help secure the IP future that I believe this country deserves. We know the global media industry is consolidating, a world in which the market is increasingly dominated by a small number of US or Asian giants with extraordinary creative, financial and technological firepower is a world in which it is harder and harder to compete. It is also a world in which, despite all the potential, will not necessarily deliver an IP future that secures the interests of UK audiences and the UK media landscape. Are we really doing enough collectively in this country? Are we really moving quickly enough in order to respond? The BBC cannot consolidate like most other media players, but we can partner at scale and across all the different activities that it will take to build the IP future I've described, from standards to network engineering, devices, content production, and even personal data infrastructures and ethics. I believe that the creative ecology that we have created in this country can prosper in an IP future, but only if we join forces in new ways with even more ambition. The story is unfolding as we speak, and it's a story that is being written on a grand scale and at high speed. It is time for us to write our next chapter together and not let someone else write it for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. In a moment, Matthew's going to join a panel discussion chaired by Simon Fell. But before we go to that, we've got a couple more keynote speakers. First, to consider technical developments over the past decade that have enabled over-the-top distribution and consequences for broadcasters. Please welcome Microsoft's media platform architect, John Simmons.
Platform architect for the Windows operating system, and I've been asked to tell you about the standards, the media web standards that I believe represent a major strategic inflection point for both the television and the internet industries. So before I talk about that, I'd like to see how much experience people have with some of those standards. How many people, with a raise of hands, have heard of encrypted media extensions? Okay, so I see some hands there, media source extensions. How about common encryption and the CMAF specification that just got published? Boy, everyone sees about that. Okay, well, these are some of the standards that I think represent a strategic inflection point for the industry. And before I go into those survey of those standards, I'd like to talk a little bit about what I mean by a strategic inflection point. I came across the term strategic inflection point reading what Andy Grove, former CEO of Intel, had said about how businesses have to transform themselves in response to some fundamental changes in their underlying business, what's changing underneath them. And sometimes you actually have to reinvent and reimagine your business in order to stay successful. And he had this book that he published where he actually talked about inflection points, points where if you aren't paying attention, your business can go down. If you are paying attention, you can start to transcend and move up. And in fact, it's oftentimes, he had a few of these bullets about what he thinks are common about these inflection points. One is the execs at the top of the company who are setting the direction usually do not see these inflection points happening. It's usually people in the trenches who are directly involved in, say, in our industry and the technology that's underpinning the business that see what changes are taking place. And it's because of that, I believe, that the television industry, if you want to call it television in italics, whatever it is you're doing when you're watching, is about to go through just this kind of transformation because of the standards that we're going to walk through here in a second. Before I do that, I want to give you a couple of reference points in terms of strategic inflection points of the past. The first one is the internet. Now, arguably, the internet was invented when TCP/IP was published in 1984. You could say, well, that's sort of, we'll call that the beginning of the internet. But in fact, I would say the inflection point for the internet was in 1989 when AT&T took the TCP/IP stack out of Unix and made it public domain. Now, why is that important? All of the companies who at that time were making a living by selling software that allowed you to network computers in your office were in trouble, but they didn't know it. Because in a very short period of time, TCP/IP was the way you network computers, and they got commoditized. They had to move up the value chain to stay relevant in the business. Now, by 1990, there were like 300,000 internet hosts in the world, and at that time, there was one website. It was in CERN, where Tim Berners-Lee had developed HTTP and HTML for the purpose of sharing data between physics labs around the world. You know, they wanted to be able to have a nice way to do graphical data. They had a rudimentary browser, and they flew around the globe going to labs and handing out floppy disks that say, here, install this and we can share data. By '92, there were 26 websites in the world. I'm told one of those websites was just a list of the URLs of the other 25 websites. But then something happened roughly in 1993. We saw the Mosaic browser appear. And at that point, we saw hockey stick growth in the number of websites. By '97, we saw well over 1 million websites. Now, I was working at that time in the tech industry. No one that I knew saw this coming, saw this inflection point was about to happen. And there were businesses who were curating content from the internet. And they basically were in trouble and they didn't know it because it was going to become discovery, it was going to become recommendations of content. The browser world and discovery world and search world were about to descend on them. So these are what I mean by inflection points. So now let's talk about the standards that have appeared over the last 10 years and what they are. And obviously we can't go into great detail in 10 minutes that remain in this talk, but I'm going to give you enough of a feel of each of these and so that I hope that you'll see how they fit together and represent an inflection point for our industries. So at the bottom, and this is a stack here, common encryption, we'll talk about that in a minute, and the CMAF specification, which we developed with Apple and then got made into an ISO standard. Both DASH and HLS, which are ways for protocols for adaptive bitrate delivery and also for defining presentations. EME-MSE, which are media source, are media extensions for commercial media for HTML5, and then progressive web apps, which is something I think is going to cap off all of these standards coming in the next few years. So in 2009, when Microsoft proposed the common encryption specification, before it was a standard, all DRM technologies had their own packaging, encryption, and encoding format. So if you wanted to distribute a movie for Marlin DRM and PlayReady DRM, you would have two entirely separate catalogs. Common encryption, like Symbolcrypt for conditional access systems, basically said, look, we'll have one packaging and encoding. It's very simple, and one encryption model, and then some little bit of header information inside the content or in a initialization segment or in a dash manifest or wherever you want to place it that allows the different DRM systems to extract a key to decrypt the content. This was essential to build the whole stack, because once you could do DRM, commercial distributed content in an interoperable fashion, then you were able to move to the next step. Now I want to jump ahead all the way to this year. In 2015, we started a project with Apple to codify what was best practices for fragmented MP4 encoding, which is what is used, that packaging I was talking about earlier for common encryption, to codify it in such a way where we could make it into what's called, MPEG calls an application standard or application format. So we produced this, we sold it across the industry. We talked with many of the companies that are in this room and others around the globe and said, we think this is a very important standard. And then by January of this year, it was published as a standard. Already last year, most companies were starting to encode to use it. And the thing that you need to carry away from this that I'd like you to know is that CMAF, or the Common Media Application Format, was in its conception thought of as something that would work for on-demand, but also for linear, low-latency, live delivery with ad insertions and closed captioning. In other words, everything that you would do in a broadcast environment is encapsulated in this new format. Now, you probably know that the web is not a very good environment. Oh, excuse me, different slide. So this is an MPEG standard. So CMAF only specifies how to encapsulate AVC and HEVC content. Well, you need to be able to encapsulate other kinds of codecs, and the CMAF spec says how to do that. So even codecs that are coming from ETSI for AC3 and for DTS already have CMAF binding specifications, and even AV1, which is from the Alliance for Open Media, which is a new codec that is just coming into the market, has a CMAF binding. And the WAVE project, which is run by the CTA, it's the Web Application Video Ecosystem Project, is developing a specification and published it at NAB last month that basically says, here are all the CMAF bindings, and here's how you encapsulate different codecs, and here are recommended best practices for using them. And the reason why this is important is now we have a global standard for media encoding that is based on common encryption. Adaptive bitrate streaming is important because the internet does not provide efficient, flat quality of service. So if you pick a particular bitrate, you're going to have these moments of buffering, and that's why there are standards, both Dash, which is from an MPEG standard, and HLS, which is developed by Apple and published in the IETF, different standards for how you represent the different bit rates for the video that you're trying to stream across the internet. Well, those two standards, HLS and Dash, did not interoperate because they didn't work with the same underlying media content. But because of the creation of CMAF, we now have the ability to have the same content be used by HLS and Dash presentations. This is for live linear content. And this does several things. One thing it does is it reduces storage and packaging costs for media. This is going to make it very inexpensive to be able to distribute content over an IP network. It also improves edge cache efficiency, and that's very important for live linear, and it produces a framework for media consumption that is cross-platform for different devices. So work on an Apple TV, it'll work on an Android TV, it'll work on an Xbox, it'll work on a mobile phone. The ability to produce content that is cross-platform and to do it with adaptive bitrate streaming, these are all the types of underlying technologies that can cause that kind of inflection point that we were talking about. In addition, right after we did the common encryption spec, Apple, Netflix, and Google, Netflix, and Microsoft went to the W3C, and we proposed some changes to the HTML5 standard to enable commercial media to be played in HTML5 browsers without the use of any plugins like Silverlight or Flash. So that was the encrypted media extensions and the media source extensions, which are now formal recommendations from the W3C, and they're broadly supported across all browsers and all embedded browsers, for that matter, moving forward. And perhaps as importantly, the W3C, in cooperation with the WAVE project that I mentioned earlier, has published recommendations for embedded browsers, what APIs they should support, as well as developer guidelines on producing web applications that can play in an embedded device. All of these advances, again, to reduce the friction for producing IP-based video delivery. The next technology that I wanted to bring to your attention was progressive web apps. And to think about a progressive web app, think of it as an app. It feels like an app, but it uses web technology underneath. And what does that mean? What is the importance of that? You can install it like a regular application. So you can go to the Google Play Store and install it, or Microsoft Store and install this application, but it's always fresh. So what that means is that it, when you update the web page that defines the application, it automatically updates every application that's already been installed. This is a kind of a blending of both the feel of an application and the feel of a web technology, but also it's discoverable and re-engageable, and by that I mean you can actually, because of the way service workers are developed for progressive web apps, you can actually search and find the application appropriate for the content. So the apps themselves are discoverable and engageable, as in you can push notifications to them, which is very important for an application model in the media space. And then lastly, it also works network independent. So because of service workers, you can install this application. If you've downloaded a movie onto your device, you can watch it on the plane when you're not connected. So it's not a browser per se, it's an application, but it benefits from all of the improved functionality that you see with HTML5. So I think you'll see that when you look at all these technologies that have come out in the last 10 years, these new standards, they constitute together a transition, a kind of an underlying inflection point, similar to what we saw in 1993 with the web. So that HTTP and HTML and Mosaic provided this mobility of internet experience. This is kind of a new thing. That it was a kind of unexpected change to the way we were going to perceive the internet. In fact, what had happened was Tim Berners-Lee had not just invented HTML and HTTP, he had reimagined the internet. So that's very important to this audience here. And the same thing is happening here with media. These same standards are creating a mobility of web media experience. And so we're in a position where we need to reimagine media consumption or reimagine television, if you, in italics, in quotes and italics. So I'm going to show two slides here to kind of characterize what I mean by reimagining television. Today we're in both the Tier 1 and Tier 2 content. Tier 1 content, which you might see over a telco or a cable or a satellite provider, tends to be its broadcast level content, linear content, and we're also seeing the appearance of direct-to-consumer content, some of it just a channel getting, like HBO, going direct-to-consumer and delivering content to them, some of it like Netflix saying, I'm a new provider, I've got some of my own content, or I'm curating content from another source, and some of it is starting to appear, which is what I would call third-tier content, which was never intended for, it was never on cable or satellite or telco. And I'm not talking about YouTube content or user-generated content. I'm talking about every sports franchise having their own channel. I'm talking about every magazine you see in a magazine stand potentially becoming a channel. This is what is made possible by that standardization, where it takes away the friction that would prevent, say, all the work that Netflix had to do to get on every device that you have in your home. I have 10 copies of Netflix in my house. I counted them once. Every TV has it. My mobile phone has it. My wife's phone has it, and so forth. But once you have these standards, getting a channel distributed broadly becomes a relatively easy thing, opening up this third tier. But it also changes authorization. So typically what you think of from a Tier 1 mainstream authorization in the legacy world is the authorization providers, whoever is providing your cable, satellite, or telco service. Then we start to see these online video distributors, which are now going to the same devices that a legacy service would go to, like a Netflix or HBO direct-to-consumer. And then we start to see the third tier. And once we start seeing third tier, then you can imagine Carnival Cruise Line will have a channel. I actually talked to them at one point about this about 4 years ago. They already have the makings for a Carnival, and it's pure advertising. Wonderful places you can go with Carnival Cruise Line. Imagine American Express curates channels that are travel related. So now you're going to be able to consume content from a variety of different sources and have it all be travel related. And the reason I bring this up is because all of these changes in the internet, all these web standards, constitute an inflection point and an opportunity for you in the broadcast world to reimagine television. Thank you.
Thank you, John. You heard it here first. We're at an inflection point for TV. Our next speaker, incidentally, John will join the panel session shortly, so you'll get some moments of questioning with John after the next speaker. Our next speaker is Steve Unger. Steve is Group Director at Ofcom. We asked Steve, not a tricky question at all, we asked Steve to consider the regulatory challenges of putting TV on the internet and how we deal with that in our changing media landscape. Once Steve has spoken, Simon Fell, former CTO at the EBU, will chair a panel session, so you'll get an opportunity to ask some questions. So please welcome Steve Unger.
Tricky question, and of course I don't have all the answers. I'll tell you that now. But it's also always worth starting by trying to understand what you're trying to achieve when you're faced with regulatory challenges. And so to start with, it's worth restating our core objectives in relation to, if you like, the broadcast ecology in the UK. And they're twofold. Firstly, we believe that the values associated with public service broadcasting endure. The ability to tell stories that reflect our society, that bring our society together, that ability is as important as ever, and that's independent of any technological change in the way those stories are delivered. So that's really important, the enduring importance of public service content. But alongside that public service content story, we also recognise the enormous value that comes from the commercial sector, the amount of choice, the amount of innovation that comes from commercial broadcasters, from Sky to Netflix to many others. And so the trick for any regulator is to ensure that we intervene in a way that effectively protects the values of public service broadcasting, whilst also leaving space for the commercial sector to thrive. In terms of the practical challenges, well, various people have talked about the changing broadcast landscape. Some basic stats. I think 90% of us still view linear TV, but 2/3 of UK adults now regularly use catch-up players, and almost half of us pay subscriptions to one of the new online streaming services. So that already tells you something about the degree of change. And from an audience perspective, it's important to remember that this is actually fantastically positive. In many ways, we are in a golden age from a perspective of a viewer. So the last couple of days, for example, I've watched my favourite public service channel, which is the Dulles on ITV, caught up with that on ITV Player. I was also able to binge view a Danish science fiction programme produced by Netflix, which I was managed to, I think, watch all 8 episodes within one day, more or less. So that ability to choose what type of content you want to watch and when you want to watch is absolutely fantastic. But of course, it creates challenges for industry, and there are broadly 2 types of challenges I'd highlight. One is the degree of fragmentation in audiences that choice brings. And somewhat associated with that fragmentation is the importance of scale. I think you only have to look at the sort of dance that's going on between Comcast, Sky, Fox, Disney to attain global scale to compete with the likes of Netflix, to realise how important scale is in this broadcast ecology now. Going back, though, to audience behaviour, I think it's always important to start with what audiences actually want to do rather than what we as technologists think they ought to be doing. This is some stats here from Enders. I don't want to go into enormous detail with these stats, but I do want to highlight there are really 2 very different stories we see in terms of audience behaviour. On the one hand, if you look at all age groups, then what you see is a gradual shift towards away from live TV broadcasting to new models of accessing content. But it's quite evolutionary. More than half of the hours of content viewed in the UK overall are still to traditional live TV. So I think particularly for a somewhat technical audience such as the one here, it's important to remember that enduring importance of traditional broadcasting. On the other hand, the youngsters are going faster than the rest of us. Only about a quarter of younger age groups are still watching traditional live TV. Most of them are now watching new types of media. As to what happens in the future, I haven't a clue. There's always this debate about how fast this change is going to unfold. I'm conscious that we've been predicting the death of linear TV since, certainly for at least the last decade, if not more. I've come to the conclusion that it's a mistake to try and predict what's going to happen next, and it's an even bigger mistake to try and predict when. What we did in our last PSB review is we didn't try and predict what was going to happen in terms of switchover. What we looked at was a base case of evolutionary change, but we also looked at an alternative version where we reach some form of tipping point and accelerating change. I think the important point then is that we don't actually know which of those directions we're going to go, but we do need to make sure that as an industry and as a country we're ready for either version of that change. In terms of being ready for that change, there are different levers that we as a regulator have in order to achieve the objectives I've already described. There are different levers in the short term to those that we have in the much longer term. So firstly, whilst traditional terrestrial TV remains relevant for a large number of people, we can still support the traditional sort of virtuous circle that I illustrate here, producing high quality content, making it widely available, engaging audiences across the piece, and then investing back into the system. We can support that virtuous circle in various ways in the short to medium term. So as a regulator, firstly, we can make sure that broadcasters continue to have access to the radio spectrum they need to distribute content in the traditional way. So at the moment, we don't see a pressure to take more spectrum away from broadcasters, giving it to the mobile industry. Now, of course, that's quite important because over the last decade or two, much of the change in broadcasting has been driven by, if you like, that policy desire to shift spectrum away from broadcasting to mobile. We don't see that as something that's likely to happen over the next decade or so. So there's a period during which broadcasters will continue to get access to the spectrum they need for traditional broadcasting. The other big lever we have is ensuring that public service broadcasts in particular get the prominence that they've traditionally got, that makes their content easy to find, that makes it actually worth doing public service broadcasting. So that combination of access to the spectrum and prominence are probably the two main levers we have to make sure in the short to medium term broadcasters can thrive. But of course, that is only the short to medium term. In the longer term, the globalization we see, it is going to happen. We are going to see the shift to online, and we're going to see that accompanied with a shift to global players of massive scale. And I think the big challenge for the UK, for UK broadcasters, for UK content providers, is how they achieve the scale necessary to compete with these global players. We don't have a magic answer to that, but what we do have is the ability to, I think, recognize the importance of scale and think in a reasonably permissive way about the competition issues that potentially arise from new forms of partnerships, new form of collaboration. I expect some of you in this room will remember Project Kangaroo. It was a collaborative venture in the UK, which ultimately was blocked on competition grounds. I think that was something of a tragedy. And I think going forward, we need to find ways of, where there are those sorts of collaborations, those collaborations are necessary to build scale. They will create competition concerns, and we can't ignore those, but I think what we can do is come up with creative ways of addressing those competition concerns. And I just wanted to highlight 3 different types of collaboration that I regard as particularly important. First and probably least contentious is just measurement. It's clear that we haven't got much chance of thriving online if we can't measure what we're doing, if we don't understand what audiences want, if we don't understand what advertisers are getting from the content that we're providing. We're very used to the sort of existing sort of collaboration around BARB and sort of measurement of traditional TV viewing. There's a fair bit of work underway, Project Dovetail, for example, to look at new ways of measuring the impact of online content distribution. I think that's really important. If we don't crack that one, the rest of it won't go anywhere. Second one I've already referred to is really collaboration on platforms. Is there going to be a Kangaroo 2? I think there has to be something along those lines, because if we are to be able to compete globally with the scale players of the likes of Netflix, there has to be a way of recovering the fixed costs of platform developments, of CDN investments and all the rest of it across a number of different initiatives. The idea that every individual UK broadcast will have its own independently produced online player, that's just not going to happen. So I think some form of collaboration around the next generation of collaborative play, I think that's really important. So I don't think it's for us as a regulator to say what type of collaboration that is. I think it's generally a disaster when regulators or policymakers try and design JVs. But what we can do is provide a more permissive environment going forward for those types of JVs. And then the final form of collaboration I'd like to highlight is actually with those global giants, the Netflixes, the Apples, and so on. There's a slight tendency to talk about them as the enemy. There's a slight tendency occasionally to almost sort of hear people talk about them as if maybe if they could just go away, then everything would be so much easier. And of course, they're not going to go away. The sort of monopoly over distribution that traditional broadcasters used to have, that's just gone forever. And there is definitely scope to find ways of collaborating with these global players, using these global players to reach the young audiences in particular that maybe can't be reached through other means. So treating the likes of Netflix as frenemies rather than enemies, I think that's really important. There are models where we can both collaborate to compete within the UK, but also collaborate globally with these new players. So in summary, what can regulation do to support public service broadcasting going forward and also leave space for commercial broadcasting? Broadly, three things. Firstly, access to spectrum in the short to medium term. Secondly, prominence for public service content, so it continues to be easy to find. And thirdly, a flexible approach to the competition issues that will inevitably arise as broadcasters, as technology companies explore new types of partnership. And I'll end on that point. Thank you.
Here we go. Welcome everybody, and we're going to run through a few questions with our panellists and contestants here, see how they get on. I'm Simon Fell. I've recently finished about 4.5 years out of the country in the EBU in Geneva, but also travelling the world, seeing how broadcasters cope with digital transformation elsewhere, and it's quite interesting to see the different countries and how they're coping with this. And somebody said earlier the UK is a unique marketplace. It is. I think we've got a very diverse range of platforms, and we're already deep into the digital transformation. But it's not the digital TV transformation that we had many years ago. It's now digital transformation in every part of life. I mean, if you work for a big corporate nowadays, you'll hear the word being bandied around in terms of how HR should be managed, how everything should be managed. And AI is one of the themes that we see in there, for example. But before we get into the questions, we've got some questions for you. So get your remote controls out again. Don't push the red button, push the one with the number on it. So we have 2 slides with questions. There's the first one. When will IP fully replace traditional TV broadcast networks? So you have 4 choices, one being never, and the other 3 being various dates. So if you could all have a stab at that one, and we'll see what we get. We'll wait for the answer. 2038. You just woke up, it's still the DTG Summit. And MHEG's still with us now.
That's remarkable. Look at that.
Wow. So it's split between never and 2035, which is very interesting given the conversation we had earlier. So it's not never, never land, but never. Okay, so that's interesting. I think the hybrid world will endure to an extent. I think it's whether you regard traditional TV as just linear broadcasting or whether you think of it as the TV in the corner with an antenna or a satellite or a cable in it. So, next question. We have another slide for you. One more to go, that's it. So, is deep investment on the part of Netflix and others a threat to the producer-broadcaster model that we have in the UK? A yes or a no? It is yes. Okay, it's interesting, thank you.
That's the other question.
Well, that's true, yeah. I think it means change for broadcasters, certainly, in my opinion. And maybe the panelists would like to reflect on that. Just wait for the remotes to go back in the box. That's the drawback to that system.
It's strange, isn't it?
It's like telling a joke in a multi-language a situation. You end up with the joke rippling round as people laugh. So, yeah, what do you think about that? I mean, maybe Matthew, you're a
the date or the
broadcaster.
Netflix.
No, I think the producer broadcaster model.
I think it is a threat. I mean, you know, the investments from Netflix, Amazon, and Apple are funded by a set of economics that don't relate to the traditional broadcast markets. In the same way that in the sports market, for a long time the value of sports rights was tied to, broadly speaking, the value of the advertising you could sell around them. And then that shifted to being related to the cost of subscriber management for large telecommunications companies. That was a different bar, and that meant that broadcasters, you know, were priced out of that market. The reality is that you know, Amazon and Apple have very broad businesses. You know, Apple's trying to work out what to do with $140 billion worth of offshore capital. Amazon is making money in everything from retailing to cloud services. And Netflix have been able to tell a story to the markets, which allows them to raise bonds and have a level of capital that is quite extraordinary. And what that's doing is that's putting investment into the creation of the content, with that broadcaster-producer kind of model, and that is inflating prices, which is a weird way of saying people are spending lots of money on really good telly, but that's, if you want the economic analysis, that's kind of what's happening. And that is a different set of economics than, you know, public subscription or advertising funding, or indeed sort of like UK subscription revenues. And those organisations are are able to amortise those investments across global markets, which we're not in a position to do, largely speaking, because of, you know, regulation and capital availability. And that does challenge the model, right? So I don't think that's really in any way contentious. No. I think that there are different responses to it, and I think the BBC's got quite a good set of those responses. I think that we've developed a creative ecosystem of writing talent and acting talent and directing talent, which means that, you know, people are keen to work with us, because actually one of the advantages of everyone thinks producer broadcasting, right, is like there's a guy who sits in a room who like orders a program and then someone goes and makes the program and then they sort of show it on it's not like that at all. I mean, the creative interchange between the commissioning and production team is absolutely one of the reasons why that works. So creative talent want to work within the BBC's view of the way that stuff is done, because it leads to a certain creative output, and I think that persists. So I think we have to think carefully about how we do that. But yeah, it's absolutely, there's no doubt that investment upstream is completely changing the industry downstream.
Interestingly, I think Netflix were recently asked if they were going to continue to invest heavily in content, and they said, yes, we're not going to stop yet. So that's interesting. But Steve, you talked about partnerships earlier and these global scale, etc. And frenemies. A lot of the programs that Matthew's company makes and others get sold on Netflix worldwide. It's a very good outlet. So it's not only a friend in that respect, it provides good resourcing, but it's putting up the cost of production for many as well, certainly in the English language world.
What it's also doing, it's clearly a challenge to current market structures. That's life, I think, in the tech sector generally. For the production sector, it's an opportunity. Our production sector has a great history of exploiting content rights globally. This is another version of that same sort of challenge. I hear from some of the production sector companies that it's a different model for commissioning for them, greater freedom as to the type of content you produce, for example. So there's a lot of positives from the production sector perspective. Clearly, for broadcasters, it creates a challenge because there's now greater competition for upstream talent. So clearly, the broadcast will have to adapt to that. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. And in the end, what audiences get is a wider range of content produced by different commissioners. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing either. So there's definitely a challenge to adapt. I'm with Matthew on that. I think, though, for me, there's certainly a glass half full version of this, probably more than glass full.
So there's no doubt, as a golden age that the risk that whether it's Tony or Anne have flagged is that the new economics drive a cultural homogeneity, and that's the risk that I think collectively we want to be kind of watching out for.
I think we need to keep the regional differences and the local content that I think Netflix would gladly have regional content as well.
Can I pick up that homogeneity point? Because I think that was happening anyway. There was already an issue that as the production sector was increasingly looking at exploiting rights globally, there was already a question about the commercial incentive to develop formats which could be sold globally rather than necessarily telling UK stories. That was already a challenge we had, and I share some of the concerns about it. But frankly, it's the flip side of trying to be a globally competitive. Having a globally competitive production sector in the UK is that we have to find ways of exporting content. So there's a tension between the desire to produce content that resonates very particularly within the UK and content you can export. So that tension is really there, I think.
And it's a different story in different countries where English is not the main language as well. But I'd like to bring John in now. John, one tech company that didn't appear on that list, but is a very big tech company. It's influenced many of our lives, certainly with Windows 95, I recall. Microsoft is a tech company, but you haven't gone that way. You haven't gone the way of being a content producer yet. Why is that?
Well, some of it's happenstance, and Microsoft. Whoops! I did it again. So, see that? Maybe that's the answer right there. Microsoft spent a fair amount of time pursuing the television space early on, and I think that. Now, the evolution of Microsoft has to a cloud computing company has put us in our interest more in being the studio for production of content rather than being the producer of content. And so, I understand why Netflix produced content to begin with. They were caught in the wholesale price transfer problem. They were purchasing content from one source and then redistributing it, which meant when they went back to renegotiate the content deals, they basically would have their profits consumed by who was producing the content. So owning the content, producing the content is important for that business. That's not a business that Microsoft is particularly interested in. It's much more interested in providing the environment for turning CPU cycles and storage that would enable broadcasters to respond to this inflection point. And if I may, to the earlier comment about the kind of what is this a threat? I think the word threat is kind of a loaded word, because if you go back to the comments I made about Andy Grove, when Andy Grove was saying that yes, business is a threatening environment, you have to change your business. You have to change when the fundamentals change, you have to rethink aspects of your business. And so yes, everything that's happening today in terms of IP delivered content, in terms of mobile and what young people consider viewing to be of interest, all of those things are forcing the broadcast industry to have to reconsider the way they're doing business. If it didn't change, it would be threatened. If it changed, it's actually a great opportunity. And the question is how best to reimagine what you're doing so as to take advantage of that opportunity.
So it's interesting, I mean, for those of us involved in standards in the TV world, the work you've done and your colleagues have done in terms of the web, and those standards coming through are making delivery over the internet much more easy to do. In fact, there are some broadcasters that are launching complete side-by-side A/B transmission chains completely in the cloud. I had a demonstration not so long ago of somebody launching complete playout chain in 10 minutes. They asked me, what do you want to call your channel, what graphics do you want to use? Hit go, and shortly the cloud-based system had spurted out a channel with a schedule of programs. Now, you know, for some of us, we spent a year designing and building such things in the past and then putting in great big chains of hardware to make it happen. So this is a revolution in terms of how that can be done, and some broadcasters are planning hundreds of channels to be delivered over the internet in that way. Whether they'll become as instantly popular as we have on the TV today, where it's easy to get exposed to many, many channels and serendipity, whether the IP future will deliver that, I don't know. But we spoke about prominence in the panel, and maybe that's something we can talk about. Is prominence something you can solve with technology? Is it something you can solve ever for the internet, or are the days of the EPG over and done with? What do you think?
Well, so this is actually the fundamental question. If you take a look at what companies are doing, we talked about Apple TV. This is true pretty much across the board. Everyone wants to be what I call screen zero. They want to be the place you go to find what you're going to watch. And great efforts have been placed on standardization of everything except for we'll just call it EPG data. If there was standardization around that, we saw this attempt at the FCC in the United States to try to get that standardized so people could get between you and your customer and like absorb all your EPG data and then present it in whatever way they want. But being screen zero is really the key from owning the customer, owning the relationship with the customer perspective. And this is going to become, however, a fundamentally flawed problem because of this large-scale growth in video services that we're talking about. I consider the smart TV experience to be entirely broken because I'm never quite sure which app to launch for which function. Whereas if I take Amazon's Fire TV, I'm perfectly happy because I've got their screen zero and they're telling me what it is I want to watch. But then if I want to watch something that's not on Fire TV, then I have to figure out which of my set-top boxes to light up on my television set or which app to launch on my mobile. So the discovery problem, the problem that basically Google leapt into with the World Wide Web and created an entire business around, that problem is still unsolved and lurking ahead of us. And capturing that discovery problem is what's really going to drive kind of replace the EPG in the future. But people will still, to Matthew's point, I think, that people will still want their linear services. There is a certain familiarity and a certain sense of belonging that you get from a linear service, and I think those services are here for the long term, even if they become purely IP-based.
I mean, Steve, before we move to audience questions, do you think that's something that can be done by regulation, or is it something that's well past that now?
So in the short term, regulation can protect the traditional idea of prominence on a linear EPG, and we're certainly committed to doing that. I think you can also imagine versions of prominence which relate to smart TVs, screen zero type prominence, although actually our current powers don't necessarily allow us to do that. I think we will get to the point, though, where the idea of prominence is just, it breaks, I think, at some point, as people start viewing content based on recommendations. So, Netflix, once you watch one thing, recommends what you're going to watch next. Various types of recommendation engine, various types of search, AI-based recommendations. There are various ways in which you can see navigation changing very dramatically, moving away from both linear EPGs and static screens. And in that context, I struggle to see how regulation can guarantee prominence, because the whole idea is to make it easy for viewers to find what they want to find based on past viewing patterns. The traditional, slightly paternal view of prominence is that we decide what they ought to be perhaps looking at, so at least we try and nudge them a bit towards the stuff that we would like them to look at. I think that just gets more difficult as the navigation methods being used by broadcasters become more proactive, if you like.
I wonder how the Amex channel in future that John mentioned, for example.
But there's an interesting tautology, isn't it? Because we're sort of, actually, Steve, you've been very clear that you're not, but there's a sort of sense that we're walking away from prominence, regulation, interventions, whatever else, and that we're beginning to feel that that's a bit paternalistic and a little bit anachronistic. And at the same time, we're having a debate that there must be regulation on news feeds and filter bubbles, and we must tell people, we mustn't just let people watch the things that they want to watch. So there is there's a paradox there. Somewhere in the middle is probably something that's the right outcome, both for commercial interests and society.
Could I touch on something that you haven't spoken about today, and that's My BBC and personalisation?
Yeah.
Recommendations is a big part of the online world. Are there any early signs of what My BBC is doing for you in terms of results?
Well, welcome back to the UK. If you now use iPlayer, you'll find a fully personalised home screen
assignment. I want to know if I've got a licence. I know
that's happened since you were over in Switzerland. We've massively surpassed our targets that we set ourselves for building a signed-in user base from scratch. Obviously, we quite consciously remained an anonymised, non-signed-in service for as long as we thought that was practicable. And then, having looked at it again, decided actually we wanted to move down the path of driving a deeper engagement with all of our licence fee payers. And so that began last summer. We have more than 10 million weekly uniques, and most of them are using a kind of personalised version of both iPlayer and Radio iPlayer. And that is surfacing recommendations. But there is an important point here, because I often get asked, well, surely that means the BBC just becomes Facebook, and we know why that would be a bad thing. And I think there's something really interesting that's happened, is that there's two things going on here. First of all, there is a wave of computing, right? John would agree, in the sense that the idea of machine learning, large data sets, is the same transition as from mainframe to PC to mobile to web. These are sort of periods in computing history, and we're moving into one where these information systems are going to be defined by machine learning, AI-driven, large data set type, cloud-based computing systems. And there's been the emergence over the last 15 years of an almost exclusively advertising-funded business model, primarily from the west coast of the US, although we always forget about the Asian guys, by the way. It was interesting. And the two concepts have been occluded in people's minds. The idea that you use machine learning type techniques in order to drive a deeper and narrower engagement with audiences in order to maximise your advertising yield has become to mean the same thing. And of course, the two concepts are completely different. There's absolutely no reason why you can't use machine learning, cloud-based computer techniques to massively improve how quickly you can identify skin cancers. Right? And there's absolutely no reason why you can't use those computing techniques to massively accelerate what the BBC is trying to do, which is have a positive social impact. It does require you to think very carefully about what a public service algorithm is, because it is different to an advertising-driven algorithm. Absolutely. And that's the really interesting work that's going on at the BBC at the moment. Having put in place the foundations, having got our ML capability spun up, having got our sign-in base built, and beginning to get the data benefits of that, we are now trying to work out, well, yes, we could just show you the next thing that you're most likely to watch, and we can just take you down that 8-episode Netflix box set, sort of deep pool. But actually, is there something else we're trying to do? Are we trying to actually show you something that you might not have expected to want? Or are we trying to show you something that actually people in the area that you live would benefit from all having seen at the same time? You know, those are the really interesting challenges that we're now getting to.
Well, the EBU developed a personalisation and recommendation platform, and one of the algorithms they came up with quite soon after they started it was a diversity algorithm, nothing to do with gender and all of that, but more about giving somebody a surprise. Because the one thing missing in a recommendation system is the serendipity of watching a TV channel. I didn't know about that. That's great. And there's something pure and distinct there that we should protect through all this navigation. Before we go to coffee, I'm going to ask you to come up with a sort of one-word point as to how we get to 2020, 35 or hybrid or never, whatever it might be, in terms of reaching this IP future. So think about that. But let's have some audience questions now with the rolling mic. Bob. And then, of course, David.
Watch out, here comes the mic.
Yeah. Here comes the mic. I think they're using a stick mic.
Don't throw that one. No.
Don't throw that one.
We're looking forward to
throw it at David. Bob's behind you.
Hi, Bob from Perform Group. In terms of standardization, lots been talked about CMAF. I was going to do a political one, but I'm not going to do. But it seems that Apple's chosen different content protection to everyone else still. So the promise of CMAF isn't really delivering 100%, is it?
This is the paradox of the Common Encryption Standard, I call it it's kind of the Lilliputian problem that has come up with Common Encryption. So Common Encryption, there are two different modes of Common Encryption. Essentially, it's AES 128, either counter mode or CBC mode. When we proposed the Common Encryption Standard in 2009, and when it got published as a standard in 2011, it was counter mode, because that's what we were using, and we pretty much convinced everyone to do that. Apple, when they approached us to develop the CMAP spec, they were making a big transition from MPEG to transport stream with HLS to fragmented MP4. They said, we'll make this change, but you need to change to use CBC mode because our DRM team doesn't want to change the way they do decryption. Long story short, we've all agreed, and by all I mean all the DRM providers have agreed that the right thing to do is for devices to support both. So Microsoft's supporting both CBC and counter mode. It's going to take a while for that to roll out, but it's happening. It's already on Xbox, so Xbox today supports both counter mode and CBC mode. Apple is not supporting both. They're only supporting CBC mode. Legacy devices that can't get updated readily are only supporting counter mode. So it's true that some of the promise of CMAF is going to be drawn out because we have to get to the point where service providers can choose which mode of encryption they're going to use. But it's my contention that although that does mean you have to have more than one version of the video to get to some devices that are legacy devices, that this is going to trail off in time. So yes, it's true, this encryption mode problem and Apple's unwillingness to support both modes is a bit of a friction, but I think it'll go away with time.
Okay, I've been given the ball, so here's the football. David, you're next. And this gentleman here. Any other hands? Putting them up now. There's one at the back.
Hello. Oh, it works.
Go away.
Right, David Katz from S&T, traditionally trying always to be in the beginning of the questions. A broadcaster is somebody who makes a transmission to many people at the same time, which is different from somebody who uses internet IP over unicast, even if he does it many times at the same time to different people. this means that I am coming to a question. This means that the economics and the communication issues around broadcasting are different materially from those to do with internet point-to-point delivery. So my question is this going to matter in 10 years' time? Now it does matter. If I wanted to make the same news broadcast to 20 million people all at once over an IP unicast system, I'd be stuck. But I can do that with broadcast.
Let's see what the panel thinks then, David.
So the question is, is this going to matter in the future? I believe it is, but maybe you don't agree with me.
Okay.
So I don't believe that's what a broadcaster is. At one point, a broadcaster was someone who stood in a field and threw seeds across it. And actually, I think the kind of term broadcasting has been reinterpreted over generations. And I've said it in my speech what I believe a broadcaster is. I think it's got much more to do into public service broadcast sense with the social impact you're trying to create than the means in which you use to do it. In terms of what will those economics do, so one of the other things I said in my speech is that it's not just the networks that have to evolve, it's also the applications. And BBC iPlayer, from its launch, has always been able to work with network operators to try and minimise those kind of loads and therefore those costs. And that's right up to the current day, where the BBC is making investments at a network level and putting kit deep into the network in order to try and manage those costs. Having said that, physics usefully steps in and says it's just fundamentally a better way of doing it is broadcast technologies for mass concurrent kind of uptake. But we do need to recognise that actually some of this is going to be audience driven, and they're not necessarily going to conveniently put them in a place where it's the cheapest for us to distribute to them. And what you'll also see is what I've referred to as this sort of editorial evolution, this editorial hack, where actually, reality, if people want to find out a news broadcast right now, a large proportion of the UK population will turn to Twitter. And that's a sort of an editorial hack that's actually we have to accommodate. And I don't know whether this will kind of come up anywhere else. But with that survey, a third of people in this room think that it's not all going to end up on the internet. That is a big problem for this industry.
Okay, David, thank you. Oh, you got it now. Right. This gentleman over here. Whoa, there you go.
I'm Simon Pearce from the National Association of Deaf and People and also a member of the DTG Accessibility Working Group. Obviously, I'm going to ask about accessibility and how that is being factored into the future developments of broadcasting and television. Looking at BBC iPlayer, I think statistics are showing that adult content, 20% of that is shown with subtitles switched on, 40% of children's content is shown with subtitles switched on. Netflix has 100% subtitle for all its content. Obviously, that's going to be a factor when VOD providers are actually thinking about where they distribute. And one of the issues that comes out is that because of the sort of the lapse approach for Ofcom with VOD and the fact that they've just encouraged providers to actually offer subtitling on VOD, that it's not actually happened. And a lot of the providers are now having problems with the platforms because the platforms are developed. Now they're having an increasing cost if they have to include the accessibility. So how can we avoid those sort of problems happening in the future?
I think we would welcome regulation. We take this stuff as seriously, I think, as anyone in the industry. There isn't complete coverage in iPlayer. Some of it's live. That's harder for us. We need to do more. We always set ourselves a high bar, and we're going to continue to address it. And frankly, I think the more people who are either willing to, compelled to have the ambition to come on that journey with us, the better. I don't know what the answer is. I think the reality is that we need to invest in the whole chain because there's no sort of single technology solution here. But if we were compelled, we already do more than we're compelled to. So I don't think that's what's driving our approach to this. It's good to be kept, honest in this debate and to do more. But Steve, you probably got a strong view.
This is a really important point. I think particularly making sure that some of the there are some content distributors who do a good job here, but not everybody. At the moment, we are working with a range of different broadcasters to encourage them to do more, to, if you like, level up to the best standards that we see out there. It should get easier with technology. Struggles, subtitles. It's not a dreadfully difficult challenge applying technology to the generation of subtitles. So it ought to get easier over time. I think we have to get to the point where making content accessible is the norm, rather than something that is a sort of high watermark for the regulated PSBs.
So we have one more question, then it's time's up, I'm afraid. So while the microphone, which one finds its way to the back there, probably the stick mic rather than the ball, unless you want to try and throw it 100 yards. But interesting, web standards are helping with this in terms of making subtitling easy to do. Machine learning and some of the experiments BBC R&D did at IBC last year, where they improved the speech recognition massively by using open source tools. Massive step forward in terms of what you can achieve. So,
it feels like there's an opportunity to make that step change, actually, with the move to IP workflows. We're just not there yet.
Final question?
Hi there, Jeremy Yates from Puppy Media. How about opening up the BBC iPlayer to other content owners?
It's a long discussed question. It's always something we said we'd be happy to consider. It's also a question with a huge degree of complexity, but it's, we have always said that is something that we'd be interested in looking at. But there's nothing else to say about it.
Well, what do the other panelists think of that?
I mean, as you say, it has been discussed on many times. You can see a benefit, potentially. There's also potential concern if it results in iPlayer becoming the only platform on which content is made available. So there is a tension between allowing access to more originators of content, but we also do want to see a choice of platforms. We love iPlayer, but we would like other platforms to thrive as well.
Worth noting, S4C is already available on iPlayer, of course. So.
Okay, well look, I'd like to thank the panel very much in the traditional way, and then it's over to you for coffee. I think Richard, unless you want to say something.
Thank you for an excellent session. The good thing is there's plenty to talk about over coffee, isn't there? So we're going to take 30 minutes for the coffee break. Please come back after that when we're going to talk about many of the issues that were raised today. Simon's going to come back and talk about the future of infrastructure and networks on a panel. We're going to deal with what happens with skills in the workplace and how we all need to change, and our businesses need to change. And finally, we've got a keynote from our former Minister, Ed Vasey, who's going to try and give us a bit of a view from Westminster and what they need to do there. So thank you very much, and please get back here in 30 minutes after coffee. So let's get back here at